Hello, this is Representative Pam Powers Hanley. Welcome to my podcast, A View from the Left Side. For many years in the Arizona House, my seat was on the far left side of the chamber. As a progressive Democrat and one of the most independent representatives in the House, I always believed that was a fitting seat for me. This podcast features in-depth interviews with newsmakers from all walks of life, as well as political and social commentary. Thanks for joining me on the left side today. Episode 12, Independent Redistricting Commission Draft Maps Ready for Public Comment, was recorded during the week of November 1st, 2021. As prescribed in the U.S. Constitution, every 10 years, the United States conducts a census and counts everyone in the country. After the census, there is a redistricting process in which the areas that have gained population can potentially gain seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. Population shifts nationally and statewide dictate that new maps be drawn to update representation in government at multiple levels. Historically, redistricting has been conducted by political parties in power in each state. This has resulted in highly gerrymandered, oddly shaped districts that are designed to keep the party in power for the next 10 years until after the next census. Allowing the political parties to draw lopsided maps, literally lopsided maps, is obviously a not fair process for the people and leads to unrepresentative government. In 2000, the voters of Arizona passed a citizens' initiative that took the redistricting process out of the control of the political parties, which happened to be the Republican Party for like the last 30-some years before this vote. It took the redistricting process out of their hands and gave it to an independent redistricting commission, also known as the IRC. By law, there are 2 Republican members, 2 Democratic members, and 1 independent member on the IRC. Arizona's 2021 Redistricting Commission has been working on new congressional and legislative maps for a few months now. Controversial draft maps, version 10, were passed by the commissioners on October 28, 2021. The maps are not final, and many people in Pima County, including myself, are not happy with the heavily gerrymandered Pima County legislative districts. Tucson proper is split into 4 different districts, ignoring natural boundaries like Interstate 10 and multiple mountain ranges, and putting urban core neighborhoods into districts that are heavily rural. These communities don't really have a lot in common. This is where you come in. The draft maps have entered a 30-day comment period. There will be opportunities to comment on the maps in person at meetings throughout the state. In addition, you can comment online at the IRC's website anytime. There is a virtual town hall coming up on Saturday, November 6th, to kick this all off. My podcast guests provide a wealth of background information on independent redistricting. You'll find out more about the Independent Redistricting Commission, the map-making procedures, the controversies behind the draft maps, and next steps. Republicans are trying to game the redistricting process by claiming more safe Republican districts than they are entitled to. We can't let them do that. Republicans rule the state as if they had a mandate and a supermajority instead of a razor-thin majority. They have no mandate. Arizona's electorate is almost nearly divided in thirds between Republicans, Democrats, and independents. Contrary to popular belief, independents are all over the map politically. I have seen independents with Trump flags and independents with Buddha flags. I have canvassed their doors. Arizona is a multicultural, multiracial purple state. The people of Arizona deserve maps that reflect our population, not maps that are based upon the desires of the powerful. My guests today are Dr. Don Jorgensen and Brian Bickel. They are long-term volunteers and officers in the Pima County Democratic Party. They have been paying close attention to the Independent Redistricting Commission and what is going on with redrawing the legislative and congressional maps in the state of Arizona. So they are my guests to give us sort of the backstory of what's going on. There are deadlines coming up for the IRC. The maps are not completely done. There are a lot of people in Pima County are not happy with what's going on down here. And so we're going to learn more from Don and Brian today. Brian, I think a lot of people don't really understand what the redistricting process is. Could you give us a little bit about the background about why we're doing this and what the process is?
In 2000, Prop 106 was passed by Arizona voters that essentially took the authority to redraw legislative and congressional district lines away from the state House and Senate and gave them to an independent redistricting commission that's picked by the leaders in the House and the Senate to redraw the lines. In theory, this was done to eliminate the process of gerrymandering, which is drawing lines to ensure that certain people got elected to certain offices. We're in our third iteration of it. We've done it in 2000, 2010, and now in 2020, something that's required with every decennial census. And following this year's iteration of the process, it's probably become more partisan and gerrymandered than it has the other two times. So hopefully we can fix some of these problems by getting people engaged in the process and making some tweaks here and there to the initiative that put the Independent Redistricting Commission in place to begin with.
What about you, Don? What do you think about what's going on with the IRC?
Well, to add to what Brian just said, it started out in 2000 and 2010 operating in a pretty balanced way. It did a better job, I think, of drawing relatively fair maps, but we have seen a big change this year. And we've seen the big change because Republicans were not happy with the results from 2010. What happened in 2010 is, and let's just look at the congressional map, the result of that was 4 solid Republican districts, 2 solid Democratic districts, and 3 competitive toss-up districts. What happened? The Democrats in most elections won the 3 toss-up districts, including right now. So we have the 5-4 edge in Congress. Well, that sounds fair. Republicans hate fair. Well, they've attacked the whole idea of redistricting from the beginning. They've opposed it from the beginning, tried to attack it in court. When that failed, now they've tried different tactics this year, starting with, as Brian pointed out, who was on that commission on appellate court appointments, who picked the initial pool for interviewing. That's a 16-member commission that is supposed to be fairly balanced in terms of the partisanship, Democrats versus Republicans, et cetera. Right before they had to start the process, I believe there were only about 11 members on that, which included 0 Democrats, just Republicans and independents. And so in a rush at the beginning of this year, Doug Ducey added 3. So on this commission, that's all you had. I mentioned Ducey having his thumb on the scale of this from the beginning. That's where it started. And so there was some question about the individuals who were picked from each side. But as a result, we now have, as Brian said, we have 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and an independent who is the chair of the Independent Redistricting Commission.
Now, the independent who's the chair, wasn't she recently a Republican? I thought she was a convert to being an independent.
I had a difficult time trying to find that, but I believe you might be correct. What's also correct then is the staff that they hire. And the first thing the IRC did was hire an executive director, a gentleman named Brian Schmidt, who was judged by a lot of observers of this process to be the least qualified to take that position. He had no experience dealing with redistricting. He was basically a political operative, and although he claimed to be independent, he was paid $60,000 by the Martha McSally campaign to put on events for her. So that's how it started, and it hasn't gotten any better since.
That doesn't sound too independent to me. When I heard about who they were hiring for that position, and also there was like a mapping company also that seemed to be sort of leaning Republican. It almost sounded like the whole cyber ninjas thing over again in a way. Let's handpick contractors who are going to do what we want. I was trying to stay open-minded, but the process has been pretty interesting. Now, you guys have attended the meetings, right? I haven't had the chance to attend meetings. I've made some comments, but could you tell us a little bit, Brian, about what you saw at the meetings when you attended meetings down here in Pima County?
The interesting thing in Pima County, and I think we've had an influence on the operations of the commission, the most recent meeting we had was down at the Tucson Convention Center. And people came in and they got in a line if they wanted to speak. They filled out a little 3x5 card and they called on people in the order they showed up. Well, one of the things the Republicans did was they all showed up about an hour and a half before the meeting started. So they were the first 40, 50, 60 people to speak. And when they all got done speaking, they all left and didn't really care to hear what the Democrats had to say. One of the offshoots of that is at the next meeting that they held, I believe it was up in Coconino County, they said, based on what happened in Tucson, they shuffled the deck. So just because you were the first one to sign up doesn't mean you were going to be the first one to speak. So now you could be the first one to sign up and the last one to speak. So it requires you to stay for the entire process and participate from a more complete perspective than just coming in, saying your piece and leaving. So it's been interesting. The chair of the Pima County Republican Party, Shelley Keiss, has been pretty open about saying what her intention is to have a congressional district in Southern Arizona that she can win. And I think that's been her goal from the get-go. She has stood up at every meeting, had nothing to say about the maps, but extolled the fact that the Republicans in Pima County have been unable to elect anybody. We're tired of it, and things are going to change.
Well, Shelley Keiss has been beaten a few times by Representative and former Senator Andrea D'Alessandro, correct?
I believe so. And she's lost to Rahul Grijalva in a congressional race, if I'm not mistaken. So,
well, and it looked like I've been looking at the legislative maps because I was very interested in how neatly compact the Maricopa County maps were and how wildly gerrymandered everybody else's maps were, including rural Arizona. It's not just Pima County, but, one of the most gerrymandered districts in Ohio is what they call the Duck District, and it has a big duck head. And so people are calling ours a dinosaur, but there is one of those maps that looks like a dinosaur. It goes up and scoops a part of Midtown and sticks it into a border district, and it looks like they scoop out Green Valley and put it into a rural district to make it more Republican for Shelley Keiss, maybe. It's fascinating what they've done to the maps. And again, the ones in Maricopa County are very compact, and they don't ignore natural boundaries like Interstate 10 or Catalina Mountain Range, things like that. So it's really kind of disturbing. They've had multiple meetings across the state. As you said, they've had them in Tucson. They had them up in Coconino County. They've been doing these different iterations of the maps. I believe they're on version 10, maybe, of the maps. Now we're going to enter a period where people can make more comments, right? You don't necessarily have to go to a meeting to make a comment. Isn't that right, Don?
There is a place online with the IRC where you can submit comments. And looking ahead, they are going to have a virtual town hall this Saturday at 10 a.m. where folks can comment live as well as submit comments.
So that's November 6th. Brian?
Yeah, I think one of the important distinctions to make, and it has ramifications constitutionally, they've been doing what they call test maps. Now, they've mislabeled them as draft maps occasionally, but when they get down to the actual iteration of the map, they're test maps. What they approved last week was the official draft map. And because it's a draft map, constitutionally, it's required to have a 30-day comment period. And that's what we're in right now, is the 30-day comment period. And the commission is going to publish a schedule of stops that they're going to make throughout the state where people can appear live and in person and make their comments on what they think about the maps they've drawn. It's not going to be as intense as it was in 2010 because the COVID epidemic has caused people not to want to show up in enclosed spaces with a whole lot of other people. But their original schedule, they had 12 stops that they were going to make across the state of Arizona. That schedule's been adjusted already because it took them a week longer to get the draft map than they'd originally planned. But the question I've got, and I don't find a very clear explanation for it anywhere, they plan on making significant changes after they hear the comments to the original draft map. My question is, if they make significant changes, does that become the second iteration of a draft map? And are we looking at another 30-day comment period? Or are they going to try and make the changes and push it through as the second draft map without having any opportunity to hear from the public about the tweaks that they did? And I gather they've never made tweaks during the process so far this year. Basically, they approve a map, and that's their starting point for the next meeting that they have to do mapping. And they kind of throw everything into the wind and start all over. If you follow their test maps, they haven't started from the grid maps and drawn up a test map and then made minor changes to that test map based on comments they've received, and then make minor changes to that one. It's kind of like, okay, let's draw a map. We'll talk about it. We'll agree on it. We'll accept it. And when we meet again tomorrow, we're going to say, yeah, we didn't like any of that stuff. We're going to make major changes to the map. That's happened to every test map they've done. So it isn't a process that's been smooth the way it was in 2010. This has kind of been throw it against the wall and see what sticks. And if we don't like it, we'll throw it against the wall again tomorrow and start all over. This is the most discombobulated, for lack of a better word, redistricting process I've ever seen.
To add to that and just exacerbate it, yeah, it's not smooth at all. And the opportunity to submit maps has been a question now too, because much of the public has submitted maps. I think Brian did. But what happened most recently is the map that was adopted as the draft map was actually created by a Republican operative in the Pima County Republican Party, but that wasn't transparent. That was kind of handed to the Southern Arizona Leadership Council, who then delivered it to one of their members on the commission, David Mio, and it only came out later that it was drafted by a GOP operative. And that's the map that was accepted, which has a lot of folks upset. And I thought it might be interesting. You mentioned that a lot of Democrats in this area are not happy with the maps. And here's a couple of reasons why. It splits Tucson into 4 legislative districts, including splitting the U of A and 4th Avenue from downtown. And there are several tenets involved in what the commission's supposed to look at: communities of interest, natural boundaries, and such. That violates a couple of them, where these are areas that work together that should be part of the same district. But the most egregious one is what's now called LD 17, or what would be called LD 17, which moves from Red Rock to Vail. So just picture that for a moment. And as you mentioned earlier, hops over the Catalina Mountains. So that violates the respect for geographic boundaries and such. And think about trying to represent that district for one. But the issue is that it becomes a non-competitive district, meaning that Democrats are estimated to have only a 29% chance of winning that. So that's that Pima County district that, as you mentioned, Brian mentioned, that the GOP county chair, Shelley Keiss, tried to push for. And surprisingly, one of her vice chairs drafted this map, and here it is. That kind of non-competitive district that ignores geographic boundaries, that has a funny shape, is basically the definition of gerrymandering. And here's why that matters. Pam, you understand this better than anyone. Think about the numbers in the House of Representatives, in the state legislature, the state house. The way this map is drawn right now, there are 14 safe Republican districts. How many seats do you need to have the majority? 16. That means they only need to pick up 2 more. Democrats only have 10 safe districts on this map. That means they have to go after 6. And one of those 2 that the Republicans need to pick up, they're assumed to have an 8-to-1 advantage, meaning out of the last 8 elections, Democrats have only won once. So essentially, that means the Republicans, to keep the majority, only have to focus on 1 district. So where's all the money going to go? Whereas Democrats will have to focus on up to 6 districts. That's what gerrymandering causes, and that's the danger here.
problem because the Republicans have run the House the last, 3 years that I've been there. They've only had a one vote margin. They need 31 votes to pass anything. They barely had what they needed to pass their extreme agenda, but they still did it. They acted as if they had a mandate. They didn't have a mandate. They barely had a majority. The Democrats had 48% of the legislature, but we barely got any bills passed. This last session, they played us, in my opinion. There are corporate Democrats who have been carrying water for Republicans for a few years now, hoping to get something meaningful passed. There were only 24 Democratic bills that actually made it to the finish line out of hundreds of Democratic bills proposed, but the Republicans got almost half of the bills they proposed passed. They are still acting as if they have a mandate, that they have some sort of supermajority in the state of Arizona, but the inconvenient truth is our electorate is almost evenly split between Republicans, Democrats, and independents. We have 48% of the seats in the legislature, and we don't have a say in what's going on. So I was just incensed that the Southern Arizona Leadership Council tried to get their maps, weaseled in there through the Republican Party and through their buddy on the IRC. I wrote a lengthy comment regarding the version 8 maps, which were the Republican drawn maps, because I live in Midtown, and Midtown is an urban area. And when I ran for office, I would say that LD9 is not necessarily that ethnically diverse, but it's definitely economically diverse from north to south, with Midtown having much older housing stock, more poor people. And what they did with that SALC map was that they really carved up Midtown. So you had areas of the city that are urban areas that are dealing with flooding, gentrification, short-term rentals, traffic, crime, all these things that are common to an urban core. And they cut up the urban core of Tucson and put it with some of these really extremely rural districts where they would never be visited. And those urban needs that we have in the urban core would just be unmet as far as I'm concerned. And so I was really upset with the way the version 8 went. I also thought it was kind of ridiculous that they all said, okay, this is fine, but we don't like them. So they all voted for them, but then they said they didn't like them, right? Which is what you guys were just referring to. So what can we do to save ourselves?
Well, Pam, one of the points I'd like to make as far as the SALC map is concerned, I mean, I'm not happy that they did it, but there's nothing that prevents them from drawing their own map. There's nothing that prevents a Republican operative from doing it. The problem is, and having submitted maps to this independent redistricting commission, is you submit a map, which means you upload it into their system, their mapping company takes a look at it, makes sure that it meets all the criteria, and then they give it a number and they put it in the queue and the commission gets to look at it. Well, what happened with the SALC map that was done by the first vice chair of the Pima County Republican Party is Neil was sitting on the dais at one of the meetings and he said, I just got a message on my phone. I've gotten a map from these people. I want to vote on it right now. That's the problem, is it didn't go through the process that the other 160 odd people that submitted maps had to go through to get it in front of the commission. That's the big rub. The other thing, and it goes to Don's point about gerrymandering, is the chair of the commission, Erica Newberg, when they were debating that SALC map and trying to get it to the point where it was a little bit more competitive, she said, well, and I'll paraphrase her, this isn't a quote, but she said, well, I'd like my right of center friends to have an opportunity to elect a representative to carry their interests to the legislature. Now, by definition, that's gerrymandering because you are moving political lines to accommodate one specific political party. She had a concern when they were doing Phoenix, and you were talking about the nice, compact, tidy little districts in Maricopa County. South Mountain basically split one of those districts in half, and that was a concern to the chair. Well, when the Catalina Mountains were splitting a district in half, she didn't seem to mind. And if you'll look at the draft map, Santa Cruz County is split in half right now because the Santa Ritas split the county in two, and they didn't think that was right. And Commissioner Lerner, Shireen Lerner, called him out on it. And she said, I don't care whether we use the mountains to split districts or not, but let's be consistent with the position that we're going to take. Obviously, that fell on deaf ears. This is pretty much a travesty. I guess one of the things that I find interesting is we have a Democratic-leaning legal team that works for the commission and a Republican-leaning legal team that works for the commission. And when the chair made that comment about making sure that her right of center friends had a district that could represent them, both firms just sat there completely silent. If this set of maps doesn't end up in court, I will be very, very surprised.
I was thinking that also. I was reading a story from the Arizona Mirror this morning that talked about how the maps were created, and it sort of lays out who's in the legislature now and who would be running against each other. And I remember some of this happening in 2010 or 2011 when the last lines were drawn. You know, we look at it down here, we look at it and say, oh, look at Maricopa County, you know, their maps are nice and neat and ours aren't. Well, some of those maps in Maricopa County have multiple Republicans running against each other. So that was kind of interesting, I thought. I mean, the legislature is going to be completely different. From my count, there will be 7 appointees starting with us in the House in January, and as many as 17 open seats from people who are either termed out or quitting or retiring like me. And so this, with the maps and all of the shuffling, it's going to be a wild ride in 2022. We're almost out of time. Why don't each of you give me a little bit of a take on what you think is going to happen in 2022, particularly with the legislature, because as far as I'm concerned, that's a big problem. We have not been able to crack the Republicans in that legislature, and we're getting really horrible bills like the flat tax and the tape down of Prop 208. So, Don, you want to go first? What are your parting thoughts?
Take cover, although I don't believe that. I believe in fighting, because it's going to get worse. If you have such a gerrymandered map, which means you're going to have all these safe Republican districts, as you pointed out, you're going to have a bloodbath in those primaries. And who's winning Republican primaries? The most extremist Trump party candidates, which means that when the legislature comes back into session, there's not going to be any pretense of trying to work with Democrats or doing what's best for all citizens. So I think it's going to be as tough or even tougher than you experienced last year, unfortunately.
I would concur with what Don just said. I think we've kind of looked at dominoes here in southern Arizona when Congresswoman Kirkpatrick announced that she was retiring and not going to run for re-election, and Kirsten Engel is running for that seat, resigned from the Senate, which caused an appointment, and it was a member of the House, which caused an appointment, and Representative Freeze is not going to complete his term, so that's causing another appointment. It's going to be fruit basket turnover in Phoenix during the legislative session. And the scary part of it is, yes, you're taking some House members and appointing them to the Senate, but that leaves open seats in the House. And you're appointing people that are good people and ultimately will make good representatives, but they're coming into the last half of a legislative session that they have no idea what's going on. And they're going to figure out just about the time it's time for the 2022 election. And, oh, yeah, this is what I should have been doing for the last 150 days. So there's a little bit more stability on the Republican side. They're going to have their problems too. I have concerns about the congressional maps. You know, we've been fortunate in having a majority congressional representation. I figure that may shift in 2022, but it's going to require the Democratic Party to do a significant ground game to get our people elected in close districts. I was doing some work on the map that's out there, and the state party thinks we've got 2 districts that are toss-ups, and they are. One of them is 51-49, one of them is 50-50. Those are true toss-up districts. And then some of the ones that are leaning, the lean is like 52-48. It's not a big lean. So, you know, the fact that the Republicans have 2 to 3 to 4 more solid seats than the Democrats do, we can flip the legislature, but it means we're going to have to run the table as far as flipping all of the toss-ups and the leaning districts. So it's going to be an interesting year politically.
It's going to be a wild ride. From my count, there were only 12 districts that might not change unless somebody loses. But after looking at the Arizona Mirror article, some of those districts that I thought might be relatively safe, there's like 4 Republicans running against each other in some of those. So some of those safe Republican districts could have completely new people. It's going to be like throwing the cards up in the air in some ways. And so I don't know if it was the Dow or the Wolf of Wall Street that said when there's great risk, there's great opportunity. So I am hoping for opportunity in 2022, and I'm not going to look at that risk. And so I'm hoping we can make big changes in the legislature and maybe hold our ground in the Congress. I really appreciate your comments today about the redistricting. This is a really important process that everybody has to pay attention to. And I really appreciate your help and all of your diligence. Both of you guys have been so involved in the process and great at keeping the rest of us informed. Thanks so much for tuning in to A View from the Left Side today. If you enjoyed the show, please consider liking this podcast on social media and becoming a subscriber. This is Representative Pam Powers-Hanley signing off. Until next time, please take care of yourself, stay healthy, and stay vigilant. Hello, this is Representative Pam Powers Hanley. Welcome to my podcast, A View from the Left Side. For many years in the Arizona House, my seat was on the far left side of the chamber. As a progressive Democrat and one of the most independent representatives in the House, I always believed that was a fitting seat for me. This podcast features in-depth interviews with newsmakers from all walks of life, as well as political and social commentary. Thanks for joining me on the left side today.